Welcome, everybody. I'm Suzanne Peretti-Kuhn. I am the facilitator for the Exascale Computing Project's Workforce Development and Retention Action Group. Our mission is try to make sure that there is a robust participation in high-performance computing and other fields of computing by people that includes everyone, diverse peoples, and also underrepresented groups in computing, at least traditionally underrepresented. What our mission is to inform and share ideas between the DOE Exascale Computing Labs and universities and associated collaborators about how to build a strong and robust workforce. So today we are super lucky. We have Reed Milewicz from Sandia National Lab here with us to give us a talk on inclusive mentoring. I think this is probably a very apropos talk for those of us that are mentoring students this year. So with no further ado, Reed, would you like to get started?
All right, thank you. And not to forgive me, I have a tiny bit of a cough. But if I speak in a lower register, I cough less. I think it's allergies at this point. Let's see. So I'm going to share here. And then, make sure it's the right slide. 1 second. There we are. Sure. All right. Can everyone see?
Looks good. Reed,
All
just
right.
to talk about questions before we get started, if there is a quick burst of question, like something that you can answer in a word that's pertinent to what you're saying, I'll interrupt as soon as there's a good point to do that. But I will collect questions from the chat for the end of the talk if it's something that would require more than a clarification.
Gotcha. Yeah, I plan to talk for about around 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, but there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. We'll make sure of that. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Reed Milewicz. I'm a computer scientist and a software engineering researcher at Sandia National Laboratories. And today we will be exploring strategies for inclusive mentorship in computing. So what we're going to discuss today is one, how diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, shape effective software development practice. We'll look at the value of mentorship in building and sustaining a capable HPC workforce. Then we'll explore how a DEI lens can really help aid our understanding of what are the best practices in mentorship. And then finally, we will close out with a discussion on how we can put all of this information to good use. And with that, what we'll start with is really at a high level, I want to explain to people where I'm coming from as a software engineering researcher and why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important from my perspective. So I'm a software engineering researcher, and in my work, I seek to model, understand, and predict the factors that lead to high-quality software systems. So people like me are interested in understanding how people come together to create software, and we want to find better ways of working. That is, better tools, better techniques, better processes that can empower those people to achieve great things. Now, in this effort, I think that the field has enjoyed considerable success because many of the tools, practices, and processes that are employed by software engineers today really do trace their origins to research. And along those lines, within the computational science and engineering community, I really want to advance standards of evidence-based practice in the development of that software. So the term evidence-based practice reflects both a movement and a set of techniques and methodological perspectives for answering this question. Now, the goal of evidence-based practice, or EBP for short, in software engineering is to integrate the current best evidence from research with our practical experience and our human values to improve decision-making related to software development and maintenance. We want to balance different sources of information to be able to make the best possible decisions we can. And when I say evidence, I throw that word around a lot, and I want to clarify what I mean, and then we're going to see how DEI fits into that, because I think there's a pretty vital connection. In the EBP paradigm, there are different kinds of evidence, when we're talking about what works and what doesn't in software and computing work, right? And there are trade-offs between them. So you often have a diagram on the left of what you'll see. It's called an evidence hierarchy. So at the base of the pyramid are our experiences as practitioners and our needs and our values and those of our customers. That is the foundation of all our decision making, and that is where we have the greatest breadth and variety of evidence. Now, what research adds to that is rigor and depth in focused ways. So as you move up the pyramid from grade literature to case studies to experience reports and systematic reviews, you get specific, more rigorous guidance. So there's less evidence to work with, but the evidence is of higher quality. So the idea is that incorporating many different points of view, many different forms of evidence can help reduce our bias and mitigate our risk. And now within all that, there is a connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion that really does shine through. So I, for one, see software engineering really as engineering unconstrained by physics. So the materials we work with are infinitely malleable. We are limited only by our imagination, right? So in that way, software reflects us. It reflects our ways of working and our ways of thinking. And it is intrinsically human and is intrinsically social. That is to say that software development is a fundamentally human activity. It is created by humans and for humans, and of course, it should serve the interests of society and reflect the values that we hold. And those values, those experiences, those things form the foundation for all principled judicious action, right? So as a researcher, I'm interested in studying the impact of diversity in software development, the impact on those experiences and values, and articulating effective strategies for creating inclusive cultures in that context. And I myself, of course, as someone who is both on the autism spectrum and someone who is LGBT, this, of course, is a topic near and dear to my heart, but it's not just my personal interest. DEI is not something that is separate from software development, because it really does get at the heart of what software practice is. And when we talk about evidence, the best available evidence we have tells us that DEI matters in software development. There are many, many studies that have delved into these topics, but just to highlight a few, we know that gender diversity, for example, is correlated with increased productivity and reduced turnover and conflict in software teams. We know that having diverse educational backgrounds, teams that have that tend to rank higher in team efficiency and various metrics of collaboration by bringing together people who can kind of unite these different perspectives. And among diverse geographically distributed teams, we find that teams with lower perceived distance, they tend to be more collaborative and coordinated. And what we mean by that is that geographic distance, all things being equal, it tends to make teams less effective, right? Especially in a globally distributed development when you're across cultures, across nations. But all things considered, there's a mediating factor, which is their ability to maintain mutual awareness and trust, right? So this idea that being able to come together and bring together diverse people of many different talents and backgrounds and perspectives, very broadly defined. It could be age, it could be educational background, it could be cognitive styles, it could be personality, right? We're speaking very broadly here when it comes to diversity, but we know that these things can help teams thrive if they are able to leverage the talents of all of those people effectively, right? And moreover, and what's even more interesting to me as a researcher is how a DEI lens can inform the design of practices, processes, and tools. It can help shape those things. It can help make them more effective. And ultimately, that benefits everyone. So just to give two small examples, I was involved in an interview study a while back, for one, on transgender software developers and their relationship to remote work. And what we find is that remote work, it offers a mechanism of control for identity disclosure and empowerment of those software developers from marginalized communities. That is, remote work gives them greater control over how they interact with others, and it gives them the power to set boundaries for themselves. And meanwhile, I am contributing to an upcoming book on DEI and software engineering. And there's a really nice chapter I want to highlight where I'm showcasing a study where they were looking at the needs of visually impaired UI, UX developers. So front-end developers who are visually impaired. And for those developers, having good coding standards, for example, it really does matter, right? We often think about accessibility as a user issue, not a developer issue. But what they demonstrate, Pandey and others, is that like having descriptive comments, having meaningful variable names, it doesn't just make code more readable for everyone, it also makes it easier for visually impaired people to develop mental models of code and to collaborate more effectively. Because if you have the code and it says button 1, button 2, button 3, right? It's really hard if you can't see the UI very well to know which button is button 1, which button is button 2, and so on, right? And the takeaway from both of these, is that we often don't actively think about inclusion in our tools and practices, but we see how we often stumble upon solutions that benefit people from underrepresented groups. And that often leads to improvements that can ultimately benefit everyone. In the second example, good coding standards, that helps everyone. And good coding standards that account for different people's abilities, that's going to give us better code all around. And that's an idea that I want you to hold on to when we get in, since we're getting into mentorship, because we're going to return to that in a moment. So today I said we'd be talking about mentorship. And I want to situate mentorship and our need for it in the context of developing a skilled and capable HPC workforce. So by mentorship, for the purposes of this talk, we mean a relationship in which a more experienced or more knowledgeable person, a mentor, helps to guide a less experienced or less knowledgeable person, who we'll call a mentee. So it's a working alliance between professionals where we are invested in the personal and professional development of all involved, but especially the mentee. And within that, there are many different benefits to mentorship for mentees. So Cram's classic mentor role theory that was developed in the 1980s, which kind of undergirds much of our understanding and our common sense understanding what mentorship is in the workplace these days, holds that mentorship serves two broadly defined functions. So that's career development and there's psychosocial development. So career development, that's where we're helping mentees develop the competencies they need to thrive in the workplace and mature as professionals. That can include coaching them on their career, providing them with challenging assignments, or giving them opportunities to develop new skills. It can be increasing their exposure to professional networks, increasing their visibility, and then advocating and sponsoring their career development. Meanwhile, psychosocial mentoring, that focuses on supporting the mentees' personal development and their sense of belonging in their career and in their organization. Now, that includes engendering a sense of professional self, serving as a counselor, as a sounding board, building those bonds of respect and endearment, and sometimes acting as a role model for the mentee. And the key here, the important thing about mentorship, is that both of these things are equally important, and they ultimately serve a broader objective. So in mentorship, we aren't just learning a mechanical set of skills, right? We're learning what it means to be something. We're picking up on all of these different norms and narratives and ways of seeing the world that shape our identity as professionals. And the ultimate goal is that mentees feel like they belong in the profession, that they can take on that identity. And that's, of course, what makes mentorship very interesting from a DEI context, because mentorship can support the growth and retention of professionals from underrepresented and marginalized groups by, bringing them into the fold, by making them feel that they're valued. Because a chief challenge for someone from an underrepresented or marginalized group is that they're often an outsider. So how do they become an insider? It's not just training or education that makes them an insider. It's also the adoption of this professional identity as part of their whole selves. That is not something you can teach in a book, but it is something that mentorship can help provide. And as a researcher, I like it because a DEI lens on mentorship can assist in developing a more comprehensive view of what it is and what it needs to be. Because underrepresented and marginalized groups, they often face similar challenges as their peers, some unique, but often similar. But the key is that they often feel the effects of those challenges at a much larger scale, right? Because they're on the outside looking in, right? And as we saw earlier, inclusive ways of working can help everyone, and they can lead to stronger teams, and they can lead to better results. So I do also have some specific reasons for wanting to promote mentorship among the HPC workforce right now. So our community is continuing to rapidly diversify, and I think this is best exemplified by the research software engineering, or RSE, movement. So the past decade, we have seen the rise of the research software engineer as a distinct professional identity, or the RSE. And the RSE movement has been flourishing in the past decade. We are seeing the creation of official RSE departments at national labs and universities. We are seeing the emergence of national nonprofit RSE organizations and the establishment of all these different conferences, workshops, and other colloquia for better understanding, well, what is RSE work? How do we do it better? And while everything in my presentation today is relevant, I think, to everyone here, regardless of your background, I like to focus on RSEs as a sort of a focal point, because I think they're emblematic of a lot of broader trends that are happening right now in the HPC community. So as we look to the future, sustaining that growth by promoting the skill development and the career advancement of those RSEs, that's going to be a priority, right? So currently, there are no formal education programs for RSEs. There are very few pipelines as we would see for conventional software engineers or for researchers, right? A lot of people who are RSEs have a background of science or engineering, and what they discover is they have a passion for software, and they kind of pivot towards a career where they can focus on software, right? And as a result, we know that RSEs come from this diverse variety of backgrounds with different competencies, different learning needs, and mentorship will need to play a role in directing those career trajectories. There are other reasons too, of course. So as we move into the exascale era and beyond, it's an exciting time, but we also anticipate there are going to be many, many more disruptive cycles of innovation in computing technologies. So we know that RSEs are going to need to remain current with their knowledge across all these different disciplines, right? It's highly intersectional work in order to meet the demand for high quality software. Moreover, we also have to consider, how do we retain talented RSEs? Because what we want to do is we want to sustain a vibrant community of practice that is capable of meeting those needs. Because if we can't retain the RSEs we have today, they won't be there to mentor the RSEs of tomorrow. And it's a multifaceted problem, but I think we can't ignore the role of professionalization and the role of identity and creating communities that people want to stay in. And I, for one, hold that mentorship can help with that. And I think that we need to be prioritizing mentorship. So before we get into the DEI aspects on mentorship, I do want to share just some highlights, high-level stuff from some ongoing work my colleagues and I have on understanding the mentorship needs of software developers more broadly. So there are things that we already know. There are things that we know people are looking for in mentorship, what they're hoping to get out of it. One, when we're looking who's an ideal mentor, we know they're looking for people who are honest, that are listening to them, that are trustworthy, and most of all, that are able to make time for them, that are accessible. And the ideal outcomes in mentorship, they vary. Some people prefer or lean on psychosocial development more, other people lean on career mentorship more, but universally we find that they want to have help in developing the skills they need in their career. They want help on how do I navigate these different problem-solving situations in my work, and how to critically reflect on my own decisions. They want advice on how to make progress in their career. And in doing so, they want help on navigating the bureaucracy, navigating the politics of their institutions. So mentorship can serve many, many different functions for different people, right? And a unifying theme, though, that we find before we go any farther is that a lack of time to provide mentorship, that is the number one barrier, right? If we want to encourage mentorship, it has to be framed as a first-class concept, something that we just normally do in our professional practice that is supported, and institutions need to be allocating resources toward mentorship activities, not just mentorship programs like, training or matchmaking or what have you, but funding people to have time to prioritize mentorship work, because it is work. It's a lot of work to help build someone else up and support them, right? As a mentor, right? And as a mentee, the same thing, to have time for that learning, that growth, and that professional development. So what we'd like to do now is just probe a little bit deeper by looking at mentorship through a DEI lens in search of strategies that can ultimately help us build stronger mentorship programs and stronger mentor-mentee relationships. So we know in general that work remains to be done on inclusion in STEM. I don't tend to focus on the negatives, but it's just a fact, right? So we know that LGBT STEM professionals are more likely to experience, harassment and professional devaluation compared to their non-LGBT peers. Meanwhile, we have women in STEM. Women also tend to have less social capital than men in STEM. They often perceive their climate as less welcoming or even more threatening, right? Where they feel that they don't belong, right? And of course, we know that there's recurring issues for people of color. That discrimination, harassment are documented causes of underrepresentation. So there are some negatives here, right? But the general thing is that all of these things are ultimately threats to that sense of belonging. You feel like, well, is this the right place for me if I'm having to deal with all these other people, right? Where do I fit in, right? And in figuring that out, that's where we're interested in getting at the heart of mentorship practice. So as we mentioned earlier, if we study practices like software practices through the lens of DEI, it can help enrich our understanding of those practices. And along those lines, we can study mentorship, right? We can see, okay, so what are needs that, specific communities might have with respect to mentorship? Are they similar or different from others? And if if there are certain things that work really well for that particular group, that we can extrapolate upon that. Maybe that works for more people, or maybe there are ways in which this can give us insights into how to do mentorship programs and mentorship relationships better, right? So what we're going to do is I want to bring up an example of a study for this is one of those book chapters, one of the some colleagues and I have written on the mentorship of women in open source projects. So we have relatively little data on software development in scientific computing contexts, but we do have a lot of data on open source projects because they're out there. People have been studying them for a couple decades now. And what we did is we looked at the challenges that women face in receiving mentorship in open source software projects, and we looked at possible strategies that projects are using to help overcome those challenges. And what we did here methodologically is we actually sort of did a double study. We looked first at mentorship of women in OSS contexts, but then we also paired that with a review of mentorship of women in the broader workforce. We looked at mentorship challenges and strategies in nursing, in K through 12 education, in policing, right? And try to say, are there things they have in common, right? Are there things that are just unique to the software world, right? And what we found is that, many of the challenges are not unique, right? But there are many strategies that we've found that have worked elsewhere that we want to bring to bear on software work. So that's what we're going to look at here. So I won't spend too much time on the barriers. There are many, and once the book is published, I encourage you to read over that. Along gender lines in general, we know that women developers are underrepresented in OSS projects. They have a higher disengagement rate than men. There are many different reasons for why that may be, ranging from gender bias, a lack of confidence on the part of those developers that are affecting rates of early disengagement. Vandana Singh, who is a leading researcher in this space, as she phrased it, is that women in open source software development often have to engage in vexatious labor to prove their worth and maintain their place in community, because there are a lot of people that think that they aren't competent or that they're not as capable, right? And they're having to, and one interpretation of that is that women in open source software, they really are seeking a sense of belonging. And that's being held at risk by these barriers to inclusion. So some of these barriers are personal. So a recurring theme, for example, among our studies is that women are frequently both seen or may see themselves as less capable than men. And as a result, women professionals, they may be reluctant to seek mentorship because you don't want to seem like you don't know something, or you seem like you need help, right? You don't want to be viewed that way, right? And of course, some of them are relational. We found that women tend to mentor other women, men tend to mentor other men. In the case of open source software, there have been studies that say like 93% of all mentoring interactions are same gender, right? And part of the problem there, that's a good thing in some ways, because they're finding people that they can get mentorship from. But part of the problem is that there are fewer women in general, so there are fewer women available to provide mentorship, right? So what I want to do is kind of walk you through some of the practices that are recommended in the literature, like best practices for mentorship that we found in our study, kind of in this review. Some of them, I think, can be generalized, right? And that's why it's really interesting to look at them, not just for the benefit for women, which is good enough in itself, but also how this can just inform mentorship program design more broadly. So one is like matching women with women mentors. So women benefit from having mentors of all genders, but there are particular benefits, of course, in matching people with people that are like themselves, right? That they have someone that they feel that they can be comfortable around, that can provide them that unique kind of perspective. They can see their future selves in that person. But at the same time, we should be encouraging having multiple mentors. So hybrid models of mentorship, like mentor networks, peer mentoring, and group mentoring, this can lessen the problem of not having enough women mentors to match those women mentees, or not having enough, any of those individual mentors having enough time to fully devote themselves to that mentee, right? And normally when we talk about mentorship programs, we think about matching one person to one person, but really we should be thinking about matching one person to many, right? And see how we can provide a support network to help that person grow, right? And then another thing that comes out of it is that we really do need to make the goals of mentorship explicit and anticipated outcomes. And that includes psychosocial support. So what we found is that if you don't say that we need you, like the mentorship isn't just training specific technical skills, it's about building building someone up personally and professionally, just holistically, right? That there's a lot of people that will think mentorship, they say, oh, well, I've taught you how to do this thing in C++, that's it, right? But if you tell them, you tell them, oh, well, also career counseling, also how do I deal with this difficult emotional situation at work, that's explicit, people do it, right? But it's about encouraging that. A couple more that come to mind is this need for inclusion-aware mentorship training. So mentorship programs really do need to be geared towards inclusion through intentional training and guidance that can raise awareness of the need of these underrepresented groups, right? So studies indicate that having these inclusive environments, it's more important to women than to men, and more important to underrepresented groups in general, to those that are already well represented, right? So with the understanding that women may be less likely to seek mentorship, there are those that argue that women mentees should be educated on the importance of mentorship. They should be given many different strategies to initiate contact with potential mentors, both formal and informal, right? And we should be encouraging them to actively seek and maintain their mentoring relationships. And that this could help with disengagement, it could help with burnout, right? A couple others is that when we have formal mentorship, it's an opportunity to monitor progress. And if relationships aren't working, we'd rather that women be allowed to exit those relationships and find ones that do work for them, right? Because a bad mentor-mentee relationship can absolutely sabotage your view on getting into a profession or getting into software development, right? We should also be recognizing and rewarding mentorship, especially mentorship of women, but mentorship in general, right? Like I said before, there's often not enough time for it. People aren't given enough resources for it. And we want to elevate and recognize the important work that people are doing in mentoring, right? And then finally, there are opportunities to connect women with various online support communities, especially in software development. Have other people that they can talk to, recommend various networks, both internal to the organization and external, right? And all of these things could be valuable, right? Now, in general, and this is across this study and some others we've got going on, mentees from underrepresented groups, they are seeking mentors who are understanding and accepting of their whole selves, where they want people who promote a culture of welcoming and openness that engender that sense of belonging, and that are able to provide the different kinds of mentorship that they need to thrive, both career mentorship, but also psychosocial support, right? And that these things are equally valuable, especially for underrepresented groups. So I want to take all of that information, and we're going to kind of talk about that and return to this question of how do we build up computing professionals, in particular RSEs, but not limited to that, in the HPC workforce. So what does this tell us? What do we need to do? How do we make this information useful, right? So there are definitely when it comes to RSEs, there are definitely long-term needs that the community has. We need to be rolling out training and education programs. We need to continue to build up collective institutions like the US RSE organization and others. But mentorship, fortunately, that's something we can start taking action on now. There are things that we can have teams already start thinking about. We can be setting up onboarding strategies for them. We can be working with organizations to build out mentorship programs. Now, in the long run, providing those RSCs with mentorship opportunities, that's going to require explicit institutional support. So institutions can help this effort by specifically carving out overhead funds to support mentor-mentee activities and relationships. This could include formal mentorship programs, tailored training for RSEs who want to offer mentorship or receive it, then incentives for engaging in that mentorship, and most importantly, as we said before, protected time for mentors and mentees to interact. And I want to call out a particular program that I was really pleased with that I think we should be doing more of. So I had the fortune of getting a week-long training experience on a Train the Trainer course on training people up on mentorship, right, from the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences and Research, or CIMER. So their goal is to provide evidence-based, culturally responsive interventions for mentors and mentees at all the different career stages of their development, right? And it's a really nice course. I think it exemplifies the kind of things we need. I was really pleased with it. I would encourage others to figure out how to get signed up for those courses because I found it incredibly enlightening. right? They have tailored curricula for different disciplines and different organizational contexts. They have interactive exercises, and they provide all these measurable learning outcomes. So, as someone funding or supporting this activity, right, that they can actually have things to measure. They could say, we have seen a marked improvement in people's confidence and ability to provide that mentorship and more satisfaction as a result of it. Right now, that's just a shout out to one particular example. There are other mentorship, programs, organizations, and other things that we should emulate and model ourselves after. But I just wanted to call attention to that particular one because it was especially good. So returning now to the mentorship needs of RSEs, right? My colleague Miranda Munt and I, a while back, put together a paper on this very subject, and I will be speaking to some of the details from that. We like to point out and just go on the record and say that addressing diversity and inclusion, it is critical to the long-term success of the RC movement. So RCs virtually by definition arrive at that field from very diverse backgrounds. It's a highly intersectional discipline. And for that reason, ensuring that everyone has a voice, a presence, and a sense of belonging is important to RSC's personal and professional development, right? So an important part of that, is to be able to create that vibrant community of practice, like we talked about. And to promote dialogue and to spur future work in this direction, we identified 3 key areas based on, the available literature and our own experiences, where we believe that RSEs have distinct needs that mentorship programs can help address. And what I hope you'll see, is that there are ways in which our work on DEI, the things we just talked about, right? And, using the lens of DEI to study mentorship, it can help enrich our understanding of how best to achieve all of these things in practice. So just at a high level, want to go over some of these things that, organizations could be doing and specific things they could be doing to promote these kinds of computing professionals and improve their career trajectories. So first, we know that RSEs come from that diverse variety of backgrounds. They have different competencies. They have different learning needs. And we also know that the environments in which they operate are highly interdisciplinary in character. And as a result, no single mentor is going to be able to supply the necessary organizational, engineering, and domain expertise to a new RSE. So RSEs ideally need an effective network of willing software engineers, domain experts, and organizational culture mentors, rather than framing this purely as a one-to-one relationship. And we saw this also in our DEI study, on the needs of women in software development. And it's a good idea, right? This idea of encouraging networks of mentors, right? There are many different reasons why that would benefit people, but it's especially effective for people who are kind of in this intersectional space, whether that's their personal background or their professional background, right? To have access to different people and different perspectives, right? So the next one is on long-term mentoring relationships. So in industry, it's pretty common for developers to hop between jobs, say every 2 years. And that is radically different from the culture of many universities and national labs, where we can have staff who remain with the same institution for many years, if not decades. And it's especially important for RSEs, who need longer to be onboarded and longer to become fully effective members of a team. Moreover, these RSEs, they're constantly transforming, right? They have to stay apprised of changes in technology, industry, and science in order to remain relevant within their field. And in that sense, we have to have a mentoring model that is geared towards long-term growth, where we are providing these computing professionals with the opportunities to continue growing throughout their career. Otherwise, we are at risk. We are at risk of losing talent to industry who can provide those opportunities, right? We want to create a space where over the course of their whole career, they can continue to thrive and grow and feel certain in their career trajectory, right? And then finally, when we're certainly not the first to point this out, my colleague Miranda and I, but RSEs, more so than most software engineers actually, require training in soft skills, right? So RSEs, they have to communicate with domain experts, they have to navigate research institutions as a software professional, and they have to articulate software engineering best practices in the scientific domain. Unfortunately, RSEs rarely, if ever, receive any formal training in applying those kinds of interpersonal skills. And an explicit goal of RSE mentorship needs to be to fill that gap. So that can and should include counseling mentees on relationships with colleagues, encouraging self-reflection, lining up work opportunities to exercise those soft skills. And that's something that needs to be explicitly promoted, because what we find is that the kind of technical people we have in our HBC workforce, they tend to focus on just that, the technical, less so the social. But really the social, given the increasing complexity and diversity of our work, that's becoming more and more and more important. And we need to have a workforce that is capable of working together effectively, right? So we need to be training on these skills. So all of these things, you can see how there are opportunities where DEI view, both for RSEs, but also for seeing opportunities where we can learn from, other groups of people, like marginalized groups, underrepresented groups. All of these things can help inform the design of more inclusive mentorship programs and stronger mentorship, mentor-mentee relationships. This is something that benefits everyone, and this is something that we need to focus on. And I think that mentorship in particular is an especially powerful vehicle for achieving the kind of career growth and community building that we are seeking in our community, right? So just to summarize, so today we covered how diversity, equity, and inclusion, how these things shape effective software development practice. We talked about the value of mentorship in building and sustaining a capable HPC workforce, right? And how this DEI lens, thinking about the needs of just different groups of people and how we can build more inclusive cultures, this can aid our understanding of best practices, in computing, but especially in mentorship, as we saw here. And there are ways in which we can put this information to good use. We can be designing inclusive mentorship programs. We can be building communities that are more inclusive, right? And that this will ultimately help us with a lot of our retention and career growth challenges that we currently face, right? And with that, what I'd like to do is open the floor for questions and for discussion. I know that I just covered a lot of material, and I'm happy to go over any of that.
Thank you so much, Reed. We've had lots of interesting questions and good comments in our chat. So I want to make sure that we get to all of those that were there. But let's start with the most recent one, because it sort of implies to just what you just said. We have a question: how can an intern with autism who is assigned menial tasks show initiative leading to prove him herself capable of technical work?
That's part of it. Part of it is, and as someone on the autism spectrum myself, that one of the challenges is that a lot of people in underrepresented groups or marginalized groups often won't speak up for themselves. And it's important that, we have formal mentorship structures that ensure that they get the support they need, and that way they have the opportunity to position themselves for success, right? Because if you have a good mentor, someone who is saying, I'm going to help find you work or find you opportunities where you can showcase and develop your skills, and that will increase your visibility, right? I think that those things are really, really, really key, right? But there's also another part of it about, like, in general, that everyone's contributions, no matter who they are, right, should be respected and should be valued and encouraged, right? Even if they should never just be seen as menial, right? I think that there's a deeper cultural issue there in terms of how we value everyone's contributions and everyone's work. But I don't know if that answers your question. And
everyone, please feel free to unmute your mics. I am going to pull up some of the other question themes that came up in the chat really quickly, just to cover a few of those themes, Reed, and you can make comments, and I want people to unmute and further what I'm asking, Reed. But we had some simple things like, when is your book going to be published? So I don't know if you have a publication date.
Yes, here soon. We are finalizing, by the end of March, we're finalizing the camera ready for everything. Just making edits and tie-ins between chapters. But I'll be happy to let y'all know when it is. It should be just sent off to publication, and then within the next month or 2 or 3.
So some of the other themes, people asked about, what about mentoring for mentors? And you covered that a little bit with the CI, the institute that you covered.
So this is okay, I will say this is, I think, is sort of historically been a blind spot in mentorship research, because the traditional view of mentorship is that the mentee is this blank slate upon which that we mold and shape into this successful professional, and that that the mentors, what mentors get out of it is, if nothing else, just like personal satisfaction, right? But in reality, mentors are developing skills too, right? And exercising skills. There are skills needed to do mentorship. So there's two parts of this. One of it is that we need to be thinking about mentorship not just as an onboarding thing, not just as an early career thing, but as something that we are doing throughout our whole careers, right? So a person who is a mid-career is going to have a more senior mentor and someone else that they may be mentoring, right? And how do they get what they need from that mentor, and how do they give what they need to the mentee, right? And we need training on that. And I think Summer is an example of a program that really approaches this more holistically, not just from the mentee's perspective, but also from the mentors, right? So I'm really happy to see that there are these programs that are taking mentors' skill needs into account. But you're right. A lot of what I talked about is really focused on the mentee, and that really is a reflection of research priorities, I think, in the mentorship literature.
On that same vein, there were a lot of interesting comments in the chat about how to reward or encourage mentors, like giving them a 10% overhead account, I think was one, not research dollars, and also awards.
Go
ahead.
To that point. So one of the things we find in our own research is that everyone's doing mentorship, like all across the board. Everyone we talk to, they say it's important. They can all point to mentors that they've helped shape their lives, right, in impactful ways. They're doing it all the time. They say, oh yeah, I've got this person that I'm mentoring, right, all over. But it's not well operationalized, right? It's not something that is routinized in the way that other things are. So by comparison, in software practice, we have this idea of code reviews. Code reviews are something you do as a quality check on the code. We have norms and practices and tools and definitions and strategies, and it's just a normal part of work, right, to do code reviews. But we don't have the same sorts of norms and practices and tools, in mentorship in computing, right? Even though it is something that we normally do. Right? It's seen as something external. It's seen as something that's HR's job to figure that out, right? Or it's someone else's job to set up the mentorship program or whatever. But we should be thinking about mentorship as a core professional practice that we're all doing. So a core professional practice that, should be treated as such and invested in as such, right? They wouldn't say like, well, I don't code reviews. You're not writing new code. I don't want you doing that. I just want you to get the code out the door. That would be insane, right? But we say, oh, we're not going to pay you to do mentorship, even though mentorship is how we actually build and sustain a team that isn't going to fall off the rails when one person retires, right? But it's not prioritized as such, and that's something that needs to change.
So Kim, excellent. You have a question. I'm really excited based on your comments to hear what you're going to ask. Oh, you're muted. Hold down your space bar. Can hear you now.
Okay. Hi, Reed. I really appreciate your enthusiasm for all of this. I do have so looking at this, I've looked at mentorship, sponsorship, the inclusion of DEI. That was a bad pun. And it's really freaking hard when you have a population that is half the population, women, who routinely have to deal with, half the population, what the stats are like, for sexual assault, 1 in 2, and you are a woman in tech and you're forced to deal with dudes, no matter what. You have to, a lot of that's, it's intense, and also usually rife with bad things.
Yes.
You're talking about mentorship, and I'm like, well, what about sponsorship? And I'm like, what about the research that's already been done? What about, and you're talking about trans folks who have been able to utilize virtualization in a good way, whereas virtualization, especially when COVID started, knocked half of us out of the park in a dealing with toxic workplaces kind of way. And so hearing you and looking at all this stuff that I think I already know, I guess my question is, how can we incorporate like trauma counseling and or a level of compassion that is compensated? That's what I don't, those are my main stumbling blocks in this.
No, you're right. And I'll be frank, I think these are enormous problems. I really didn't spend a lot of time on the negatives, on the barriers, because I often find that doesn't sell well to a broader audience just to talk about how bad things are, even though they absolutely are. They absolutely need work, and we're not doing enough to actually solve these problems. But trying to figure out how we can incorporate, better practices from the ground up. Like I said, like all of these things, like this, we say like trauma counseling, everything. We don't think about that. We think about it as something that's external to the work. We think about it as external to our professional selves, right? That like this
You
is,
might think that. I'm sorry. A lot of
when I
us
say we,
don't think
I
that
think it's fun.
externally.
No. I mean, like I'm saying the normal, there's a widespread belief. When I say we, I mean the community as a whole, right? And it's a recurring problem that we don't prioritize the things we need to be prioritizing. We don't, we're not doing enough to kind of make these things part of our core professional practice is what I mean, right? And when I say we, I don't mean like people here necessarily. I just mean broadly speaking, because it's very common in technical fields, right? We're often focused on just that, the technical. There is this kind of frame of mind, this ways of thinking and working that overlook a lot of the human, the needs, right? But to your question though, it is a really hard problem. And like, I don't know how to fix the broader problem. My small intersection here where I think that we can make a modicum of progress is in normalizing these things in software practice. Because in those teams, on a team by team basis, getting those teams to make these things normal and accepted and routine, care, investing in each other, and recognizing the human in each other, right? I think that is a small way in which we can make progress, but it's a much bigger problem than that.
Right. And I'm as a woman in tech, what I have seen many times is no, you as a woman in tech, your experience is your experience, but I'm trying to focus on this. And when you try and change something without taking in the base level of the truth of how people are experiencing something, and then like without taking into account the trauma and the experience of other people while trying to build a mentorship program, it seems a little.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think that's like, I think it's a really good point.
Got some resources if you need them.
I would. I actually think that's a really good angle and something that we need to focus on. So yeah, please feel free to send me any of these resources. I'd be interested in incorporating that.
So I know that some of the labs at least offer counseling a certain number of hours as part of their health benefits, but I don't know how broadly that's applied and if that's enough towards what you're talking about.
I mean, it's a culture thing, and yes, it's going to change eventually, but it's going to take a long time. We all acknowledge this. However, pretending everything is okay does not have favors, in my opinion.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge people's truths like that for sure. And you're getting a lot of clapping hands, by the way, Kim, among the
right.
Oh, thanks. Someone has their hand up, by the way.
Yes. Shadraha, Kiran, would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Reed. I think that was a really helpful talk from you. We kind of don't hear a lot of sessions on mentoring, especially in this area. And as a budding HPC professional specifically, I've been looking for mentoring in this field, and it's pretty hard to find mentorship in this area. So my question to you is are there any communities or are you aware of any such group of people or you yourself that might provide some mentorship on this particular field so that someone like me who is very, very new to this can sustain for a longer time in this industry? Definitely, it's a very interesting field, and there are lots to explore, lots to learn technically wise, but to find a mentor is a little challenging.
It is a common problem, and this is one of those things where institutions need to be stepping up and providing many different opportunities for networking both formal and informal for mentorship, right? Because there's a couple different ways in which people find mentors. So there are relationships that just kind of grow organically from within a particular work, their specific work group. Then there are ones that they meet through various networks, affinity groups in an organization. Then of course we have formal mentorship programs, right? That try to match people based on their talents, their interests, and their backgrounds on, to help provide that kind of mentorship that they need. But in terms of, I'm not as familiar with, cross-cutting organizations and groups across different labs that provide kind of mentorship. I will say for RSEs in particular, I think that the US RSE, which is the national, this formed as a national organization for people doing computing and as kind of computing work in HPC, has a Slack channel, for example, and there's a lot of really good dialogue, people meeting people. And I think I see opportunities there to help strengthen, mentorship relationships. And my partner in crime, Miranda, in the chat, perhaps, Miranda, do you know of any groups, opportunities, anything like that, or can speak to the USRSE as a touch point for people looking to meet others?
There are active conversations to set up some sort of more solid mentorship network, but right now it's all very grassroots in the way that works. However, the way that community is designed is to be very open and inclusive. And we even have, we have it in our manifest and we have it in our code of conduct that we have to, adhere to these sort of standards. But generally people within it are very open and happy to help with mentorship in any sort of mechanism. But there are conversations about a formalized way to do it. It's just very informal currently.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I can.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Hey,
Other
we're
questions?
getting more questions in the chat. Dan Milliken, would you like to ask your question, or do you want me to ask it? Oh, you're still muted. Press maybe your space bar.
Showing is muted, but is it coming across now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I love mentorship and have always kind of enjoyed doing it. And in my kind of role now, I'm able to do a few, but I'm finding that really women are sticking with mentorship a lot more readily, and they're kind of getting to the end and happy to make goals. A lot of the men that I'm mentoring seem to sort of fade away and stop, wanting to be mentees. Maybe it's me, so I fully accept that. But I'm wondering, kind of thinking about this conversation. Are there tools? What are some ways to kind of build skills to be a better mentor as a man to women, in light of there being so many kind of systemic issues for advancement, for improvement?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things I pointed out when I was mentioning, for example, that women mentees benefit from women mentors, it's that they're, it's really just as part of having a network of other mentors, many of whom will be men, right? I think that, that ultimately women need to find mentorship across from many different people. Many of those people will be men, and there's many opportunities in order to build really strong, successful relationships, right? And there's in general, like I mentioned, there's summer and there's other training programs on inclusion, right? But really just a lot of it is just thinking about figuring out how to ask the right questions and make sure that you're providing the mentorship that that particular person needs, right? Because they may or may not feel comfortable saying, well, this is actually what I need. But I don't know, if you're able, willing, or comfortable to provide it, right? I think that some of it is in training to be a better listener, right? A lot of it, I think, is just trying to figure out what their actual needs are, right? And sometimes the needs are like career-based, right? Sometimes the needs are psychosocial, right? And the ability to kind of move back and forth between those things becomes really important. And that's something we don't often train people. We generally don't give people training on mentorship in general. But one of the things I find, and this is something I found, especially among men mentors, just as a rule, is there tends to be a more focus on giving all mentees the things that male mentees would be asking for. And oftentimes it really is more of a focus on the career aspects of mentorship, which are really, really important. And that's a really, really important part of the mentorship, right? But it should also be thought of as, how do we build up the person's whole self, right? And what does it take to do that? I don't, I don't have an immediate answer for you in terms of what specifically you can do better other than the things I've covered in general. But that is kind of the core of the idea, is to be more responsive and willing to be open to providing the kind of mentorship that a different person may need. Or finding them other mentors, right? They say, well, maybe I'm not well equipped to give you this kind of mentorship, but I can find you someone that can, or having that, the willingness to do that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that, kind of where I would come out from this.
Are there other questions? You can raise your hand or unmute. While people are getting the courage to do that, I have a question based on some of the things. I haven't been able to capture everything in the chat, and I apologize for that for everyone that's asked questions, but there was sort of a theme of the idea of like, sometimes you get mentored. I guess I'll use my experience, but it's only one illustration of this. You're mentored by somebody that tells you how to take something on. And it's not something that will work. For example, I had a fantastic male mentor this last year, and he had a very nice, aggressive style, but I can't do that. It's just not natural for me. And also, I don't think people react to me well. It's sort of surprising to come from this sort of soft-spoken female, all of a sudden this aggression, it's viewed as like, wow, what's wrong with her? And that idea that like you have to think about how to make it your own, the thing that people are giving you, and that's a hard thing to do. So what you were saying about multiple mentors, when I had that mentor tell me, I needed to go, choke people and yell at them, and not really, but the sort of like really aggressive things, I think I took that information to my other mentors that were more culturally similar to myself, said, how would you take this? And they kind of helped me reform it. So I think your point about there being multiple mentors is really important here when you're trying to look at like sort of this intersectionality of how we react to each other based on what we perceive each person to be as a category.
So each person, like when they're as a mentor, you're kind of speaking from your innermost experiences, everything you've learned, the relationships you've had in the past, right? And there are certain things that may work for you, right? That may or may not work for another person in a particular time, in a particular place. Part of that is the willingness to be open and honest about saying, and that was one of the things that people keep asking for in mentorship is honesty, is honesty and open communication both ways, right? Is saying, well, this may or may not work for you. This is what's worked for me, and try to frame it in that way and say, other people may approach it a different way, and there's opportunities for you to learn from other people. But I think it's an opportunity to learn from each other regardless, right? So you say, well, why wouldn't this work for me? Why am I having this reaction where I'd say, I don't know if I should be doing that, right? And the ability to have that dialogue. I think that's what's key, right? Because no mentor knows everything. No mentor is going to be like, I have exactly what you need all the time, or what worked for me is going to work for you, right? We know that, right? So it's more about having that kind of that open, honest dialogue, right? And that self-reflection. I think that's really key. And I think having multiple mentors can really help with that, because you're able to draw upon different people's perspectives and say get different opinions, right? And I think it's a healthy way to go about it, rather than assuming that the mentor-mentee relationship is this one-to-one, right? Which for a long time, people have always thought of it that way, but as sort of as a network of support.
I have a comment. Could I say? So my name is Melissa Moreno. I am a intern in engineering, but I love mentoring, and from a student perspective, I've both mentored and been a mentee mainly, but I wanted to make a comment what you said regarding recently I've been hearing a lot of talk about how can we retain people in the workforce. And honestly, like having good mentorship can make a huge difference. So the same way that we see training in counterintelligence as a mandatory thing, I think mentoring should also be considered something almost mandatory or required for people to be able to to navigate through their career. And most people haven't been mentored properly, and very few people have luckily had good mentors. So some people don't even know that they need a mentor because they've never been properly mentored. So I don't know if there's a way, or a petition that we could potentially like start to say, hey, maybe at least for managers, there should be a required mentoring program. My background is I'm prior military. Before I could supervise people, you were like you had to take a 2-month long training to become a supervisor. And obviously not saying that we can, pay for that long for that many managers to do that sort of training, but something of the sort, maybe something smaller.
I think we can. I think especially within the national labs, we can pay for anything for which there is the will and the determination to make it happen. Like it's not a shortage. I don't think it's a shortage of resources. I think that we are fully capable of getting those resources if we make a compelling case that we need them, right? And I really do think that there should be more courses, right? We do all sorts of training, right? In our education and throughout our careers, but mentorship often doesn't receive the same priority, right? Both in terms of actually funding mentorship activities and in providing that training. And I think that what you just described, this idea that to fill that role, we should both honor that it's a commitment and that people should be, compensated for it, but also that it's a skill. It's a skill that people should be taught on being a mentor and being a mentee, right? Because a lot, like you said, a lot of people, they may not even recognize that they need mentorship because they never really had a good mentor-mentee experience they would define as such, right? But those that have, people that have had really the opportunities here are so great, right? Like people who have really good mentorship experiences, it can be life-changing. It can be like career-defining, right? It's so powerful. It resonates, right? So that's, I think that we should be focusing on that, and we should be, what you're suggesting is that we should be providing that training. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing it up. I like that you have that perspective from a different kind of organization entirely, where this is something that you go through, right?
Right. So we are at the time. Reed, are you able to stay on for just a few more minutes if there are more questions?
Yes, I have a few more minutes.
Okay, do we have any questions or comments?
Thank you so much for this. I'm definitely gonna try to tell my mentors about it.
So we have a question from Rashonda Spillers-Nowlin.
Yeah, that's correct. My question was, what do you think about having a dynamic of one mentor and a group of mentees? So not only, so that way if the mentor can't give the mentees what they need, they can glean from each other experiences.
I think there have been mentor-mentee models like that have been explored in mentorship programs, and they can be very successful. The main concern is that you want to make sure that it's good to have you can have one mentor to multiple mentees, but the workload can become an issue. And this is actually something you see, especially for like organizations that want to say, let's say like promote the mentorship of women by women, right? What ends up happening is that if there are relatively few women at the top, then there's kind of this expectation that they should be raising up the next generation. And then they have multiple mentees to whom all of the workload is kind of put upon them to make sure that that's successful, right? So I like the idea of having mentees that can work with each other, right, and learn from each other as well as from the mentor, but it's also good to have multiple mentors, right? If only just to be fair and say that, this is a commitment, this is work, right? And it's got to be multiple people that are helping those multiple mentees, right? I think that's the right way to look at it. But I do think that mentees can learn from other mentees. There is peer mentorship programs where they try to match people that are much more similar in skills, like say a junior and a senior in college, right? So they're a little bit further along. They have things they can share, but they're pretty close together. But that can work. That can work. So yeah, there's definitely research out there that shows that can be effective. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
All right, thanks everybody. It's glad that everybody's very interested in this topic. Reed, these were great ideas. I think it's really spurred our thinking.